Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill Obrien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to this Monday edition of the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 6th day of May. It is a beautiful Monday here after several days of rain and overcast and fog and hail and wind and all of that. We have an absolutely gorgeous day today, and I think by the time the end of the afternoon comes, we're actually going to get up close to 70 today, although right now it's probably in the 50s outside, but it's very, very beautiful. The sun is shining, and it's a beautiful day, and it's the beginning of another week, and here we are on the program, and I'm very excited about it. And again, I appreciate the continued support that the folks who listen to this program and who regularly listen to Bob's program in the evening and to other programs on the Head On Radio Network. I really, really do appreciate your continued support. It's because of you that we do it, and it's because of you that we're able to do it. So thank you so very, very much. We would love to hear from you. We spent our last program on Wednesday. We were dealing with the issue of property, John Locke, and I think some very, very important issues that we raise, and there are more, believe me. And I think you'll be both surprised and I think interested, because I think some of this stuff is really, really significant. We would love to hear from you. We have a toll-free number that'll get you directly into the Head On Radio Network studios, and Agnes is there, and she'll get you on the air immediately if you call. It is a toll-free number. It's 1-844-THE-HORN. That's 844-THE-HORN. And obviously, as we know, if you're using a landline, you need the 1. If you're using a cell phone, you do not. You just dial 844-THE-HORN. And of course, the horn in numbers is 843-4676. So all numbers 844-843-4676. If you'd like to send a message to me, a direct communication to me, you can do it in either one of two ways. You can either send me an email, or you can communicate with me through our Facebook page. If you'd like to send me an email, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. If you'd like to communicate with me via the Facebook page, you can do that by going to one of the posts, on any one of the posts on our Facebook page, because after each post, there are two links. There is a share link and a comment link. If you click on the share link, it sends that particular posting to all your friends on your Facebook account. So in other words, that gives us a wider exposure. And of course, that's obviously something we would be grateful for as well. If you click on the comment button, it gives you an opportunity to make a comment directly to me. Presumably, it would be about the posting itself, but it doesn't have to be. It can be anything related to the program. In other words, you can use it in place of an email. And the minute I read it, or the minute I get it, my Facebook notifies me that there's a comment on one of the postings. And then it takes me directly to the posting, the particular posting, and gives me an opportunity to read your comment. And I'll know right away what the comment is in reference to, and I can respond accordingly, either on the air or by finding, by responding to you with my own comment or another email, an email to you or something like that. The point is, we would love to hear from you, and we would love you to take advantage of the opportunities we have so that you can communicate with us and share your thoughts on the program. Because the one thing we want to make sure of is that the program is meeting your needs and is working to your benefit. If it's not, then it's a waste of time. So that's a really important part of what we're about. I also want to announce, and I'll try to remember to do this again at the top of a second hour after our break. We will not be doing a program Wednesday, nor programs next week live. Going to a grandson's graduation, and in out of state, and it's actually halfway across the country is the reason we're driving. It's going to take us a while to get there. So, and the graduation is this weekend. So we won't be able to do a program for and we'll be leaving on Wednesday and be gone for the following week. So I just wanted to make listeners aware of that, and Agnes will be plugging in previous programs, archived recordings of previous programs. So I just wanted to make that announcement. However, it looks like we will be able to, we will be doing a program today and tomorrow too. So I want to emphasize that as well. Since we were last together on Wednesday, of course, a lot has happened, and a lot continues to happen. I think and this is a little bit disturbing, and that is that John Bolton, the National Security Advisor to the President, announced that a carrier strike group is moving into the Persian Gulf because apparently we've received indications or signals that the Iranians are posing a threat to some of our military. At least that's what stationed overseas. That's what Bolton's announcement said. And the fact of the matter is, that's pretty unnerving. And it's true. And I've heard reports that the carrier group was already in the area. It was already in the Mediterranean. So and the Adriatic Sea, near Greece. So it wasn't a tremendous redirection or redeployment in a sense, but to move the strike group into the Persian Gulf suggests it's obviously designed to send a message and to Iran. But the fact of the matter is, it sends a message to other potential sources of threat as well, and that's unnerving. And I think as we go through our program today, if you keep that in your mind, not just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, I think you'll begin to realize how unnerving it is. And I think we'll be getting into this at the front end of our program. But there are a number of things that I wanted to make reference to that are going on the national level. And in some ways, they seem to be hard to explain. And in other ways, there are ways to explain them. And so that's what I hope to be able to do as part of today's program. One of the things that's most interesting, I think, that happened since the last time we were together occurred on Friday when it was reported that President Trump phoned Vladimir Putin and carried on a conversation that lasted in excess of an hour. And they talked about various topics. And the president was talking about, was telling the media that, about the conversation and some of the things they talked about and all of that. And it's really interesting because one of the questions that one of the media folks asked the president was whether, in fact, they had talked about Russian interference in our elections. And the president's response was that topic, we didn't even raise that topic. And when you think about that, it's concerning. Because not only is there evidence, and I think the Mueller report documents much of it, that the Russians did interfere in the 2016 elections. But there's all sorts of evidence that they are continuing to do that as we approach 2020 elections. And so it's an ongoing threat. And to not even mention it is unnerving to a lot of people, and I'm one. The Mueller report came up because the president couldn't wait to tell the media that when that topic came up, Vladimir Putin smiled on the phone. And of course, the immediate question is, he smiled through the phone? How do you know he was smiling? But that's what the president said. And then he made the comment that it began. Putin made the comment that the Mueller report, the whole issue began as a mountain and ended up to be a mouse. And of course, we're used to mountain and molehill. But Putin used the word mouse, and that's the term that's the story that the president repeated. So in a sense, what basically President Trump was saying is that just as I do, Putin believed that the report pretty much exonerated him. And by definition, exonerated by not proving what Trump refers to as collusion with the Russians. Then the implication is it takes the Russians off the hook as well. And it doesn't. So, but this is disturbing. Another thing that is extremely disturbing, and this happened late yesterday, and the big news this morning, is that the president has threatened China that if they don't reach a trade deal by this Friday, then the 10% tariffs on Chinese imports into the United States will be increased to 25%. Now, if you think about it, 25% tax on anything is pretty significant. It would have major economic impact on China and also on the United States, because it would raise the price of goods imported from China to such a degree that American consumers couldn't and wouldn't pay it. Now, it used to be that the whole idea behind a high tariff was that if you put it on something that consumers would buy, irrespective of the tariff, then what you did was force consumers to turn away from the imported good and buy American goods. That's why it was always referred to as a protective tariff, because the purpose of it wasn't to raise revenue, because it likely wouldn't raise any, because it would be so high that American consumers would no longer buy the product, they would buy our product. And at the time that you impose protective tariffs, that's the whole point. You're trying to encourage consumers to buy American rather than foreign competition. In this case, if this actually comes to pass, it would threaten to slow down the Chinese economy significantly. And so consequently, from China's perspective, this threat of raising tariffs at all was a threat, but obviously it was not a big enough threat to interfere with the flow of goods and trade itself. But 25% would be, and China has already made clear that it would be. And so China considers this, an economic act of war, so to speak. And so when you combine that with the idea of the carrier group in the Persian Gulf, you begin to come away with some pretty serious concerns about what's going on, and are we saber rattling around the world? What are we doing? And is it in our interests, or does it threaten our interests? Because let's remember, things have changed in the two and a quarter years, if you will, since President Trump has been in office. He has trashed NATO. He's trashed the United Nations. He's trashed the European Union. And so many of the allies in the alliances that we always had aren't there anymore. So in many ways, we're treading unfamiliar waters here. And the person that's doing the treading can't swim anyway. In other words, for him, the waters are totally uncharted because the president has no experience in international diplomacy at all. So he's flying blindly, if you will. And it's hard to be comfortable. The stock market has reacted incredibly. It opened 500 points down at 9:30, and I haven't looked at it since. But it was flirting between 450 and 500 points down, the Dow, for the first hour until about I was watching it until about 9:30 this morning when the market opened, and then I watched it for the next half hour, and it was fluctuating back and forth between 450 down, 460 down, 480 down, then back down to 460, etc. So what direction it's headed in now, I don't know. I also don't know whether this redeployment of the carrier group into the Persian Gulf might have had an impact on what's going on in the market as well. The market is a barometer of some of the things that are going on in the world, obviously. So it's causing a sell-off. The threat of tariffs, 25% tariffs against China, is driving down investments and promoting a sell-off. So it's unclear. All we know is it's volatile. It's risky. And there are a lot of things going on that are risky. And again, we're doing it with somebody who just got their driver's license, so to speak. So it all of it makes one nervous. All of this is what's going on right now. But it's background to something that I think begins to make sense out of things that don't really seem to make sense, if that makes sense. And what I mean is, these things seem to be unrelated, seem to have little connection other than the person who's doing it. And it almost appears that these things are happening without rhyme or reason. There doesn't seem to be a pattern. There doesn't seem to be any reason for some of these things. If you're going to do this, why would you do that at the same time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? It's really interesting because last Saturday, day before yesterday, in the New York Times, was an article by Roger Cohen. It was a political article. It seemed to have no relation to any of this stuff that we've already talked about at all. It was about Joe Biden. And it was about whether, in fact, Joe Biden is the person with the best chance to defeat Donald Trump in 2020. No sooner than Joe Biden got into the race officially at the end of last week, he became the front runner. And he's remained the front runner. And he's running significantly ahead at this point of Bernie Sanders, who's running second. And so you have all of these Democratic candidates, announced candidates for president. I believe there are 22 now. And 21 of them are running way behind Joe Biden, who's the 22nd. Actually, he's the 21st to come in because the senator from Colorado announced after Joe Biden did, I believe. He's the 22nd. And he's very, very impressive, by the way. But Roger Cohen's article in Saturday's New York Times, before any of this stuff happened, before the carrier fleet was redeployed, before the president announced the 25% tariff rate effective this Friday if they don't reach a trade deal. So it's about the election of 2020. So there seems to be no connection. But let me share with you the point of Roger Cohen's article. I've come to believe Roger Cohen is one of the most incisive op-ed commentators that we have. Many people believe that Donald Trump is an aberration, that nothing like him or his presidency existed before, and nothing like that's going to exist after Donald Trump. That Donald Trump was kind of a bolt out of the blue, a surprise. Nobody expected him to win. He didn't expect to win. In that situation, if you believe, Cohen says, that Donald Trump was is an aberration, then Joe Biden is the perfect Democratic candidate to defeat him. because Joe Biden is anything but an aberration. Joe Biden is a fixture on the American political landscape. And if Donald Trump is an aberration, a brief thing, a blip, if you will, in a pattern that will resume into its normal pattern once this aberration goes away, then Joe Biden is the perfect candidate to make that happen. However, if Donald Trump is not an aberration, if Donald Trump reflects something much more serious and something much more long-term, then Donald Trump ceases to be an aberration and becomes instead an alternative to Joe Biden and everything that Joe Biden represents. In other words, Trump represents a wave of change. If that's true, if Donald Trump represents something more substantive and more serious than he does as an aberration, then Joe Biden is the last person to be able to beat Donald Trump in 2020. Because Joe Biden reflects a past that is being challenged by the future that Donald Trump represents. And Roger Cohen believes the second is more true than the first. According to Roger Cohen, Joe Biden represents what Cohen calls the party of Davos. Davos is the place in Switzerland where these high-powered international conferences of the world's wealthiest assemble regularly to plan the world economy. These are elites with economic and cultural prescriptions for the world. Biden has been a regular attendee at these Davos meetings. He reflects that group and the priorities of that group. What has that group done or accomplished in recent years that would produce Donald Trump, that would produce a reaction against what they've done? What this group has done in the 21st century is deindustrialize much of the West by driving jobs into China and other places that pay highway robbery salaries for low pay. In other words, these economic elites have undertaken policies and programs which were designed to lift the economy of the entire world by globalizing it and by spreading the wealth located principally in the West around the world. As a result, it would reduce, not necessarily eliminate, but reduce poverty throughout the world, and it has. It has. But what it has done is drive jobs overseas and, in effect, deindustrialize the West. It has displaced working and middle-class people in the West in favor of uplifting peoples around the world. It is the background that produced Brexit in England and Trump in the United States. It's produced the backlash, which is playing to the dispossessed. And it's the elites at Davos that gave us the dispossessed, that drove people's jobs out of the country and left them ignored, invisible, unemployed, and angry. And they were looking for somebody to give them voice. And they found it in Donald Trump. And Joe Biden reflects that group. That would mean that should Joe Biden get the nomination and be the Democratic candidate running against Donald Trump in 2020, that would open up Joe Biden to attacks as America's biggest problem. He represents the ancient regime, if you will. According to Roger Cohen, Biden will be pilloried as a faithful servant of the party of Davos that secured impunity for the financiers behind the 2008 meltdown, a heady growth inequality, appeasement of China, and the arrogance of money-drawn Democrats estranged from their own working class constituencies. Always, throughout our recent history, since the New Deal, the Democrats have been the party of the working man. But in the 21st century, they have ceased to be. They have instead become the party of Davos, the party of the global economy, the party of worldwide trade, the party of open free trade throughout the world. And Donald Trump is represents the displaced or the dispossessed that process has produced. And that group got him elected. And if we put a candidate, according to Roger Cohen, like Joe Biden as his major competition, Joe Biden is going to become the symbol that caused these people to turn to Trump in the first place. It'll invigorate Trump's mass. It'll invigorate his base. It'll maximize the turnout against Biden, as Trump's candidacy did against Hillary Clinton in 2016. There's quite a bit more to the article, but that's the gist of it. I was prepared when I read this on Saturday to make this a key part of today's program, and we have. But what I'm suggesting is that there's even more to it than that. the threat of raising tariffs against China, the movement of the carrier group into the Persian Gulf to intimidate Iran, and many of the other things don't seem to have any purpose or any common sense behind them unless you see them as part of an overall political strategy on Trump's part to appeal to his base. If you accept the fact that the president's number one priority always, one that never leaves him, is to play to the base that got him in power in the first place. Everything that he does with an eye towards his political base, towards 2020, towards enhancing his political power. President Obama's national security advisor, you may recall, was Susan Rice. President Trump pilloried her when he was running during the campaign. Said that she was selling out America, that she was making deals with other foreign countries at the expense of Americans. If you remember the campaign, you remember that everything that Roger Cohen is saying happened in the 2016 campaign. This is exactly the campaign message that Donald Trump was giving those he thought and hoped would vote for him. He saw what few others saw. Ironically, one of the people who saw it was Steve Bannon. And even though Bannon was only there for a short time, he was able to communicate with Donald Trump like few others have ever been able to do. He pointed out what this globalism was producing and what political advantage could be taken advantage of, could be gleaned from taking advantage of that. And Trump has done it. And he continues to do it. Just so happens that Susan Rice has written the lead op-ed commentary in this morning's New York Times. And in her column, she basically says that President Trump's one and only priority in what he does internationally is his political strength, his own political strength. She focuses in her article principally on the Western Hemisphere, on Latin America, most especially on Cuba and Venezuela. And she makes the point that the hard line that Bolton and the administration is taking against Cuba is setting back relations with Cuba 50 years. The Cold War is over. And the hostility between the United States and Cuba was a remnant of the Cold War. We all remember Kennedy and the threat of war when Russia was locating nuclear military capability in Cuba. And the American Navy blockaded Russian delivery of military hardware to Cuba. And as the Russian ships approached the blockade, the world was poised for the outbreak of World War III. I remember it. I remember it very well. Since then, especially during the Obama administration, the hostility between the United States and Cuba began to ease, and communications with Cuba began to open up. If you remember that there was even permission given for Cuban baseball players to play baseball in America, to come to the United States as professional baseball players. Within recent days, President Trump has canceled that invitation. Not only has he done that, but he has threatened sanctions against any country who trades with Cuba and uses property confiscated from the Cuban people as part of the Cold War. In other words, what President Trump is saying is anybody who does business with Cuba, business that involves property taken from pre-Castro Cuba, is going to be considered an enemy of the United States and subject to trade sanctions. In other words, he has undone better relations with Cuba and put the relationship between the two countries back into the Cold War era. And then there's Latin America, more specifically, the Venezuelan effort to overthrow Maduro. That failed last week. According to Susan Rice, both of these had political ramifications for President Trump, principally in Florida. The refugees, the Cubans who fled Cuba with Castro when Castro took over and came to South Florida, remain a significant political force in Florida politics. They vote, and they vote in big numbers against anything related to better relations with Cuba, so long as the Castro regime, and even though Castro's dead, the regime is still in power there. So long as that power remains in power in Cuba, this group votes as a bloc, a powerful bloc. It voted in powerful ways against Obama. And because of what President Trump is doing, it is expected that it will vote in powerful ways for Trump in 2020. So what Susan Rice is suggesting then is that what's happening now related to Cuba is linked to President Trump's re-election campaign in 2020 by playing to a significant political base in Florida. So also she says the same thing about Venezuela and those Venezuelans who have fled to the United States with the emergence of the Maduro regime. And the effort of the United States to support the revolution in Venezuela to topple the Maduro regime is, according to Susan Rice, an effort to play to the political base created from those Venezuelan refugees in this country. And then there's the president's effort to issue sanctions against the 3 Central American countries that are the source of refugees coming to the southern border through Mexico. Honduras, Colombia, and Nicaragua, I believe, are the 3. His stand against them is part of his stand against the flow of refugees. It's the basis of the national emergency declared on the southern border. It's designed principally to appeal to all those who are considered anti-foreigner, anti-Hispanic, anti-Mexican, anti-American. Susan Rice's argument, then, is that if you look at the things that the Trump administration has done in related to Latin American countries, all of it has a political aspect to it, and it's the same one. When I read that, I began to reflect this morning, and I thought, that might explain the economic threat to raise tariffs to 25% against China. China is the one that has built its economy around the jobs created from the decisions made at Davos. China is the nation that has become one of our major competitors in the world's economy, principally because of what happened in the late 90s when President Clinton was talking about globalization being the bridge to the 21st century. Remember that? China was the major beneficiary of all of that. China is the major recipient of the jobs that we lost, that Great Britain lost, that Western Europe lost. It has created a tremendous white nationalist, anti-foreign, anti-black, anti-brown, anti-yellow reaction throughout the world. It has created a movement, a revolution. We call it populism throughout Western Europe against the flow of immigrants coming into Europe. Just as in this country, it's based on opposition to the immigration coming into this country from the South. It is the base, the heart of the president's political base. So when you begin to put all of it together, you begin to get a sense that something real and something meaningful is going on. It's not a series of random, unrelated, stupid, non-thought out, impulsive reactions. As much as it is something deeper, something better planned, something that makes sense, something we better realize, and something that the Democrats better realize. There's another piece. in this morning's New York Times. That's totally unrelated to this issue, it seems. But in reality, it's not unrelated either. And the reason I call it to your attention is because the author of this piece is James Reston. James Reston was 25 years ago one of the most prominent journalists in the world, in the United States especially. He's retired. He's still writing. He's written books. He's published books. But I haven't seen his name in print in major publications for several years, until today. And he writes a piece in today's New York Times about the Mueller report and about the issue of impeachment and about the issue that the story of Democrats' reluctance to undertake impeachment for fear that it'll politically backfire against them in the upcoming elections, that it'll fire up Trump's base. I would suggest to you, President Trump is doing so much to fire up his base that it may not matter. Impeachment becomes one more factor in that effort to fire up the Trump base. But there are so many others that impeachment alone is not going to be the determining factor. At least that's the implication of what Reston is saying. The fact of what Reston is saying is that one of the 3 articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon in the 1970s was the fact that President Nixon was refusing to honor congressional subpoenas. 15 of them. 9 days before President Nixon resigned, the Senate Judiciary Committee approved a 3rd article of impeachment for the president's flouting of the will of Congress in ignoring or rejecting these subpoenas. President Trump is doing the same thing. Last week, he basically announced that his administration would refuse to respond to any congressional subpoena coming from the Democratic House, arguing that it's all an effort to dig up political information on him that Democrats can use to defeat him in 2020. So he's not going to have any part in any of it. He's going to reject all of them. Today, this morning, the Attorney General refused to turn in an unredacted version of the Mueller report as requested by Congress. In response, the word is that Democrats are in the process of working up condemnation of the president for his refusal to accede to a request from Congress. Reston's article makes the point that what the president is doing is attacking the very legitimacy of Congress to have any oversight of his administration at all. That what's really going on here is that the president is challenging the idea of separation of powers between 3 co-equal branches of government. and suggesting that only the executive branch of government should have the power, not Congress. The president believes that he's already got power over the courts because of his judicial appointments of Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. The president believes clearly, as Democrats have threatened, that his rejections of subpoenas will force the Democrats to take him to court. And he wants to go there because he believes that at the very end of that process he'll win, because he truly believes that he has rigged the Supreme Court in his own favor. He is banking on the fact that his two recent judicial appointments, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, see themselves as his political appointments and will do exactly what he expects them to do, not what their position requires that they do. In other words, he believes that they will put their loyalty to him over their loyalty to the Constitution of the United States. He's aware that they are professional justices. But he also believes that their political loyalty to him is stronger than their professional commitment. Reston believes, I believe, that he's wrong. I cannot believe that they'll go along with this. But the fact of the matter is, even if they don't, it's going to take so long to get through the process that Trump wins anyway. Because the one thing about our legal system, our system of justice, is that it's slow, painfully slow. It was created that way by the framers. That's exactly what they wanted. They didn't want a government that responded instantly to impulses. They created a political system that was based on time and deliberation and reflection, to the degree that when final decisions are made, they are the right ones. And that takes time. It's messy. It's not quick. It's not efficient. It's not smooth. But it works. At this point, that slowness works in President Trump's favor. So even if he's wrong, he wins because of the time it's going to take to get there. But he definitely believes that he won't lose. Reston also believes that Republicans, by the time you get to that point, will stand up against Trump as well, because they took an oath of office to support the United States, protect the Constitution of the United States. And in the end, they're going to realize that the threat to the system, to the Constitution, far outweighs the political loyalty that they owe Donald Trump. Reston believes that. I want to believe that. I do believe it when it comes to the court. I think Neil Gorsuch, even though I don't agree in any way at all with his political ideology, with his conservative ideology in the way he interprets the Constitution, I believe that he is a lifelong professional jurist. He is a professional. And I believe at some point when tested, that professionalism is going to reign supreme. But I may be wrong. I may be wrong. And the same thing with Kavanaugh. I thought the same thing with the Attorney General, with William Barr. But I think I was wrong there. He has pretty much trashed his professional reputation already. He lied to Congress twice on the same issue. One to a House member, and a second time to a question from Senator Van Hollen of Maryland. When he denied that he knew whether Robert Mueller would support or oppose the findings he wrote in his 4-page memorandum on the Mueller report. He already had 2 letters and a phone call with Robert Mueller. He knew what Mueller's position was. Even though he denied that he knew on 2 occasions. That's a crime, as Nancy Pelosi said last week. To lie to Congress is a crime. She also made the comment last week that Trump's decision to reject subpoenas from Congress is exactly what happened with Article 3 of the Articles of Impeachment against Richard Nixon. So she knows that connection that Reston talks about in his column today. She knew that last week. She knew that rejecting subpoenas from Congress constituted an impeachable offense. It was one of the charges raised against Richard Nixon. He resigned before any of it could be tried before the Senate. But the issue was there, and Nancy Pelosi indicated last week that she knows it. So we're back to the issue of the Democrats' professional responsibility to impeach versus the political realities of what might happen to them if they do. But I'm beginning to suspect and see that there are so many other things involved in firing up the president's base that this one issue, impeachment, that is never brought up, is not going to save the day. Trump's base is going to be fired up anyway. What Democrats have to do is make sure that their base is fired up as well. I've gone beyond the top of the hour. We're at 5 minutes after the hour. I realized that. I was kind of afraid of that when I began, because this is big stuff. This is really important. But I think that pulling all of this stuff together in a way that connects it all and makes it at least assume some sort of sense, some sort of reason, some sort of pattern, makes it much easier to understand. And it also gives us the ability to predict the future. In other words, knowing this pattern, knowing that this kind of a pattern is there, and we don't know whether this is the answer, but it's clearly a competitor in being one of the possible answers to all of this. The mere fact that we know that means that as new things continue to happen, we can weigh them in light of this pattern and see whether in fact they reinforce it or whether they refute it or contradict it. As issues come up, a pattern like this makes it possible to predict behavior. In other words, we know that if a particular issue comes up and President Trump is faced with a choice, this pattern tells us which choice he's likely to make. And if he does, it strengthens the validity of the pattern. If he doesn't, it weakens it. Doesn't destroy it, but it weakens it. And that's really what I think this program is about, is understanding the Constitution and understanding the issues that affect it and affect its interpretation. And the more we do it, the better we understand the Constitution and the system that the framers created, the legacy that they left us. And the more we understand it, the more we can appreciate and understand threats to it. So, even though we did run over several minutes into our second hour, I really think this particular portion of the program will remain significant for some time. You're listening to the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. It's right now about 7 minutes after, so that'll bring us back at about 12 after. And then when we get rid of, get through the opening remarks, that'll give us about 45 minutes of our second hour left, and that's plenty of time to get into some pretty good stuff in some depth. So we're going to pause for a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back. I hope you'll stay with us. Thank you.
return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here again is Dr. Bill Obrien.
Bob Kincaid, thank you so very much, and great to hear your voice.
Well,
I'm glad you're
kindly.
there. I'm glad you're there. That's what's wonderful.
Getting a little work done in the studio today.
Got a beautiful day today, Bob.
Oh, it's nice out there.
Beautiful, beautiful, comfortable. Oh, just great, just great. Well, listen, I haven't talked to you for a while, so I hope everything goes well. I was telling Agnes that in our first hour, and I want to repeat it again, this one, that Wednesday we'll be leaving to go to our grandson's graduation, and it's in Kansas.
Wow, is he already graduating? Amazing.
He's graduating Saturday, yeah, and he's worked hard for it. He did it all himself, worked full time, he did everything, and he made it. So he's quite a young guy, and we feel like we owe him that, and partly because he hadn't received a lot of help from people that ought to be helping him, his own parents. But
sure,
he's done it himself, and he's done it well. So, and he's already scheduled to take a master's degree there, and he's majoring in quantitative economics. I thought economics was quantitative.
I didn't know there was another kind.
I don't know, no. But anyway, that's what it is, and he's also been accepted into the master's program there in that same major. So
wonderful.
As of now, he's planning to do that. So anyway, Bob, it's great to talk with you.
Oh, it's always a joy chatting with you, Bill, and you're doing a great job today.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it.
I was sitting here listening to you thinking, I don't know if I share Bill's faith in the institutions because
I know.
Because Republicans.
Yeah, I know. My faith is shaken. There's no question.
Well, at this point in time,
at
this point in time, I'm of the opinion that the Republican Party would sell out the country, the Constitution, its morals, its ethics, its the bones of its sainted grannies for 1 nanojoule of political power.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, you may be right. I hope you're not, but you probably are. To be honest with you, I'm kind of leaning more with you than against you. But I'm still holding out this.
Well, you have to.
Thread of hope.
You have to. You absolutely have to.
And I'll be very honest with you. When it comes to people like Gorsuch, I didn't feel the same way so much as Kavanaugh because I thought the confirmation hearings in his case was so disgusting that I kept thinking there's got to be something wrong with him to even be part of this.
Yeah. Well, where Kavanaugh is concerned, but remember Gorsuch also said that it was his judicial philosophy that African-American truck drivers should freeze to death instead of leaving the truck to go find help.
Yeah.
So, and
yep.
he's also, because it's in the news, he's also the son of a woman who was the first cabinet official ever held in contempt of Congress. So,
that's right. That's right. You're right.
The Buckeye falleth not far from the tree.
Yeah, you gotcha. You got it, Bob.
All right.
Hey, listen, thank you, buddy.
Sure thing, Bill.
Appreciate you. Welcome to our second hour in today's program here at the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Let me remind you, as I did at the beginning of our first hour, that I will be doing a program tomorrow. I fully intend to be anyway. But the next day we're leaving, and we'll be gone for through our program schedule next week. We don't return until the day. Planning to return until the day after next week's program would be completed. So I just kind of wanted to alert you to that. If you'd like to communicate with us, and Lord knows there's quite a bit I put on the table in our first hour that you could comment on, believe me. And if you'd like to do that, we would love to hear from you. Now we know that both Bob and Agnes are there today. And if you use the toll-free number to get into the studio, one Bob or Agnes will get you on the air immediately. The number is 1-844-THE-HORN. That's 1-844-843-4676. If you'd like to fire off a communication directly to me, you can do it either with an email or through our Facebook page. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. On our Facebook page, if you go to one of the postings on our Facebook page, you'll see a comment link along with a share link after each posting. And if you click on comment, that'll give you the opportunity to fire off a comment similar to an email directly to me. And I would get notice on my Facebook account that your comment is there. And I would immediately go check it out and respond to it. So either way, you can communicate directly with me. And the fact that so many of us spend so much time on Facebook, going through our Facebook page might actually be more convenient for more of us than writing a separate email. But either one will work. I check each of them every day. So, and I will continue to do that even though I'm on the road. So, thank you. Thank you for your continued support of the program and of Bob and Agnes and the Head On Radio Network. I appreciate it. I know they appreciated it as well. So, thank you. Thank you again. For those of you just joining us, welcome. We're getting fired up a little bit late today. We're almost 20 minutes after the hour, so we're down to just a little bit more than 20 minutes in our program left for today. We were basically looking at a number of events and issues being undertaken by the Trump administration. We went through some of the major issues of the news today. The threat of raising tariffs from 10% to 25% against China if a trade deal is not reached by Friday. And then, excuse me, John Bolton's announcement that a carrier group has moved into the Persian Gulf in response to perceived threats against American interests coming from Iran. And I don't know what they are specifically, but they were enough to prompt Bolton and the president to respond. And so what I tried to do first hour was put all of this in context. And the context was the political power of the president and the chances of the president to be reelected in 2020, and suggesting that many of these things have one string or one issue linking them all together. And it's the president's 2020 reelection campaign and his effort to fire up his base and do things that appeal to his base. And there's no question that each of these indeed does that. And it's not necessarily, it's not my theme. It's a theme argued for by, among others, Susan Rice, who was security advisor to President Obama. She wrote a column this morning, excuse me, in the New York Times, which pretty much suggested the same thing. Although most of her focus is on Latin America, the situation with Cuba, the recent failed attempt at a coup in Venezuela, at least it looks like it's failed, and efforts to establish sanctions on the Central American nations from which most of the immigrants coming to our southern border come from. So, all of those clearly have political ramifications or implications. And that's kind of what we were playing with in our first hour. One other issue that we included in our first hour and related it to that same theme was James Reston's column from this morning's Washington Post. Reston's column was about Joe Biden as being the most appropriate Democratic candidate with a chance to defeat Donald Trump in 2020. And I apologize. That wasn't Preston's column. Excuse me. That was Roger Cohen's column in Saturday's New York Times. And that fit very well into the whole pattern because of Biden's connections with the Davos summits of economic leaders who've been very, very active in recent years in putting together the global economic program that produced Donald Trump and Brexit in the first place. The Reston column is on the issue of impeachment. More specifically, the issue of the 1974 impeachment of Richard Nixon. And as we know, he was never impeached because he resigned before charges of impeachment, were passed. But a third article for impeaching President Nixon was his refusal to accede to the will of Congress by rejecting subpoenas. I apologize for the phone. President Nixon had rejected 15 congressional subpoenas, many of them focused on trying to get their hands on those tapes, those audio tapes. And we know that eventually he was forced to turn them over. And he knew that when they were turned over, he was dead in the water. And so he resigned. And indeed that happened. His own Republican base abandoned him as a result of what was on those tapes, because they proved him guilty of obstruction of justice and of abuse of power. And the third article of rejecting or not accepting the ability of Congress to have oversight over the behavior of the administration. So I wanted to go back. I think this is really interesting in light of what we know about what's going on now. Reston quotes the committee's Article 3, article of impeachment. It charged the president, quote, "The president has failed without lawful cause or excuse to produce papers and things as directed by duly authorized subpoenas issued by the committee. Instead," it read, "Nixon had substituted his own views as to what materials were necessary for the committee to render its judgment, and had interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives. His refusal to comply interfered with the committee's ability to fulfill its constitutional duties and was therefore subversive of constitutional government." And that's exactly what's happening now, as President Trump has vowed to reject all congressional subpoenas. And his statement that it's not necessary for Mueller to testify to the House Committee, Judicial Committee, because of his written report. He's already put in writing everything that Congress needs to make its decision. And of course, we know from President Trump what he believes that decision was. And that is that the Mueller report found no collusion with the Russians, nor, according to William Barr, the Attorney General, did they find evidence of obstruction. The fact of the matter is to allow Mueller to come before the committee would allow Mueller to go before the nation and refute President Trump's conclusions about the Mueller report and also refute William Barr's conclusions about the Mueller report. The president hasn't tried to stop Mueller yet. He's only expressed an opinion which has changed from what he said Friday, which was that it's up to the Attorney General whether Mueller goes before the House committee. Today he suggested, however, that he's changed his mind. There's some debate in the media about whether he'll try to go further. If he does, it'll go to the courts, and we talked about that as well. So, for those of you just joining us in this our second hour, that was really the overview of our first hour that went a little bit more than an hour, to be quite honest with you. A couple of more things that I wanted to bring to you today. I've got a number of things. And one I want to call your attention to because I don't think, given my schedule, I don't think it's something that we're going to be able to get to. I'm not going to be able to get to by tomorrow. I don't believe. Maybe I will. But it's the whole question, which I think is interesting, of the allegation among conservative evangelical Christians that we are a Christian nation and that the founders intended that we be a Christian nation. We've made references to this issue in the past. It comes up here and there, everywhere. It seems to come up periodically. On Saturday, Susan Jacoby, who has written some brilliant pieces, she has authored a book on secularism in America, on the separation between church and state. And on Saturday, she wrote a column in which she made the argument as to why clearly the founders did not intend us to be a Christian nation, as these Christians define it. I think it's a topic that is worthy of some attention. And I'd like to kind of put it on the back burner and bring it up at a later date. But if you would like to check it out, all you need to do is go online and just use Susan Jacoby's name, Jacoby, Jacoby, Jacob with a Y after it, first name Susan, on the idea of a Christian nation. And I think the first or the second source you are given is the article that she just wrote. I think it's dated early May. And I'm going to kind of hold this in abeyance and maybe get back to it when we have time to do justice to it. It may be that tomorrow's that day. We don't know yet because we don't know what's going to happen between now and tomorrow, to be honest with you. But that's an issue that you might be interested in looking up for yourself. But there are a couple of issues that I have right now that I'd like to share with you because I think they're interesting and relevant. At least one of them is particularly relevant, and that's going to be the second one. The first one, I just want to call your attention to an article that George Will has written, which has just come out, It appeared in this morning's local state paper here, the Charleston Gazette, on James Buckley. I have to be honest with you, I didn't know James Buckley was still alive. James Buckley used to be conservative senator from New York in the 70s and 80s, I remember. He's the brother of Bill Buckley, who's the founder of the National Review. Well, it turns out, according to George Will, that James Buckley is indeed still alive. He's 96 years old, and he recently gave a presentation at the National Review, at a gathering of the National Review. And in that speech, he commented that this would be his last public appearance. He's 96 years old. Like his brother, Bill, James Buckley is conservative. So also was, as we know, George Will conservative. We also know that George Will has split, at least temporarily, from the Republican Party because of Donald Trump. George Will is opposed to Donald Trump as are progressives. In James Buckley's speech to the National Review, however, George Will heard some things that made him realize that the conservatism that he subscribes to is still alive. I think this is interesting issues. I'm not a conservative. I don't agree, but at the same time, I'm learning. And this is something that I didn't know. And I wanted to share it with you, because I'm guessing that if I didn't know it, maybe you didn't know it either. Buckley said in his speech that when he came to Congress in 1970, in the U.S. Code, there were 11 volumes. Today, 49 years later, there are 41 volumes of the National Code, the U.S. Code. But here's the point. Along with those 41 volumes of federal law, there are 242 volumes of regulations that have the force of law. Buckley says that this tremendous growth is the result of a Congress that had largely substituted its ability to reflect with political reflex. That what Congress has done is to delegate much of its lawmaking authority to executive agencies, to agencies responding or reporting to the president. Buckley says this is an abandonment of the Constitution's limits on federal authority. In other words, this speaks to what Buckley and George Will and other conservatives believe is the explosion of regulatory agencies making law and Congress shedding its own responsibility to do that. Buckley's solution to the problem, as he sees it, is for the president to announce that he will veto any bill that tells the states how to run their own business. Because many of these federal regulations, executive regulations that carry the force of law, are examples of the federal government telling the states what to do and how to do it. And oftentimes they use federal money as a spur or a bribe to get them to do it. What bothers Will, and bothers James Buckley as well, is that this has resulted in a flow of power to the central government well beyond what the framers intended, well beyond the enumerated powers given to Congress by the Constitution. And this is the wrong that Buckley believes need to be righted. And George Will agrees. And he has examples, George Will, now this is George Will speaking, where Congress has not assumed its proper responsibilities. In fact, has publicly absolved itself of its public responsibilities. In January, for example, George Will points out that Senator Richard Burr of North Carolina, if you remember this didn't happen too long ago, it was in January, Republicans in the Senate would not consider a bill funding the government without money for the president's border wall. If we remember, the Democrats approved the budget with no money for the wall, and the Republican Senate went along with it, and President not the wall. This was the national emergency, and the president vetoed it. But in response to the Republican Party not supporting the funding of government without money for the wall, Burr said, quote, "The president won't sign it. Why should we work on it?" George Will's answer: because there's value in Congress expressing its independent view of the public good. In other words, this is an example by Republicans in the Senate deferring their congressional responsibilities to the office of the president. Because the president promises to veto it, Senate Republicans say, if he's going to veto it, why should we even bother working on it? That's ultimately where George Will is coming from as a conservative. Please be aware, however, that he's anti-Trump, outspokenly anti-Trump, to the point that he has separated himself from the Republican Party so long as it stays under the thumb of Donald Trump. Basically, what Will suggests is that Democratic progressives who are trying to block the president and the growth of executive power might look at James Buckley's speech before the National Review and get some ideas as to how to block the president in his quest for more and more power. I think that's an article that is worthy of our time. It says a lot. And I'll be honest with you, as I said, I didn't know that James Buckley was even still alive. And he's 96, but he's still here, and he's still speaking. And as George Will says, I hope that he continues to do so. And finally, we're about 17 minutes left in our program today. So I think we've got time to do this, at least present the material, not necessarily to chew on it. We don't have that much time. But let me call your attention to a recent study that was done by the Federal Reserve on the issue of inequality, the huge level of inequality that exists in our society. This is a column in today's Washington Post by Robert Samuelson, the economist. Robert Samuelson is a conservative. He's a free market economist. He's at the opposite end of the spectrum from Paul Krugman of the New York Times, who is an extremely liberal economist. Nobel Prize winner as well, by the way. Samuelson makes the point that almost all the time when people talk about the growing inequality in this country, the growing gap between rich and poor, and the threat that it poses to our democracy, more often than not, they're focusing on income disparity, on the differences in income. The Federal Reserve, however, changed that and basically conducted a study on the issue of inequality, which focused not on income, but on wealth, on the increasing gap between rich and poor as determined by the amount of wealth that they have, that they own. And that wealth is comprised of cars, homes, stocks, those kinds of things. And so what they did is they conducted a study to determine the wealth that exists in the entire nation. What they found, and this is 2018, last year, what they found that Americans own $114 trillion of assets. $114 trillion in possessions, assets. This $114 billion consists of $26 trillion in housing and real estate, $26 trillion of pensions, such as 401k accounts, $22 trillion of corporate stocks and mutual funds, $6 million of durable goods, automobiles, appliances, furniture, etc. That $114 trillion total weighs against the liabilities, most of the liabilities, mortgages and consumer credit, which totaled about $15 trillion. That left a net worth of $100 trillion of wealth. In other words, the total assets owned by Americans is $114 trillion. $15 trillion in liabilities. The result is close to $100 trillion difference. How does that $100 trillion break down in our society? And here are the numbers. In 2018, the net worth of the wealthiest 10% of Americans represented 70% of household wealth, up from 61% in 1989, which is the first year that the Fed did this kind of a study. So last year, in 2018, the wealthiest 10% of Americans own 70% of all the household wealth in the country, up from 61% in 1989. And that even among this wealthiest 10%, wealth was becoming more and more concentrated. The same years, from 1989 to 2018, the share of the top 1% went from 24 to 31%. So again, 70% of household wealth is owned by 10% of the American people. And 1%, the top 1% of that 10%, controls 31% of it. The bottom 50% of U.S. households has virtually no net worth at all. In other words, what they have in assets is offset by liabilities. For example, if you own a house, its value is X. If you owe a mortgage, you got to deduct that from the value. So in many cases, it becomes a wash when you put it all together. Consequently, the Fed found that the bottom 50% of American households had virtually no net worth at all. The difference between assets and liabilities, mainly loans, mortgages especially. Their wealth tumbled from 4% of total wealth in 1989 to 1% in 2018. In other words, whereas the wealthiest 10% went up since 89 from 61% to 70%, for the bottom 50%, it went down. (4% to 1%. Their assets, roughly half, were homes. Their assets stood at $6.8 trillion, compared with liabilities of $5.6 trillion, leaving a net worth of $1.2 trillion. So the total wealth owned by half the population is $1.2 trillion. By the upper 10%, 70% of 100 trillion. Think of it. The total net worth in this country is $100 trillion of wealth. The bottom 50% of Americans hold 1.2 trillion of that, which means that the upper half hold $98.8 trillion of the 100 trillion. Imagine. In other words, what Samuelson is pointing out is that when you look at wealth rather than income, you begin to realize that inequality in this country is a bigger problem than we thought. The gap is even wider than when you measure income. When you measure wealth, it's huge. Of $100 trillion in total net wealth, 50% of the people hold only 1.2 trillion of it. The other half hold 98.8 trillion of it. That is incredible. And not only that, but it hasn't stopped. It's continuing to concentrate in fewer and fewer hands. The gap is being bigger and bigger. The wealthy continue to get wealthier, and the poorest continue to become poorer. Samuelson points out that the big losers over the past 30 years would be the middle class. Those with wealth that started in the middle and going to the 90th percentile. Their share of household wealth, though still sizable, has dropped from 35% in 1989 to 29% last year. So the middle class is losing the most. But the reason for that is that they're the ones that had the most to begin with. They had something. They fell in the middle of the spectrum as far as wealth. But now they're dropping into into the lowest third. And then Samuelson points that there's one factor to keep in mind which affects all of this. And that is that low wealth is affected by age. It's important to keep this in mind. Those who are younger, the youngest households, have lower incomes, therefore lower wealth. But as they age, their income increases. The opposite is true for older households. They save for retirement. Now they're spending it. In other words, the wealth they accumulated while they were working is going down. Mine is. I'm a perfect example of that. Through my retirement. So as the years of my retirement go on, and as I continue to keep getting a piece of my retirement savings every month, my net worth is going down. So age affects the whole issue of wealth. Because the longer you worked, the higher your income presumably was. The more wealth you accumulated. But when you stop working, that net worth goes down. So you got to keep that in mind. But the overall study is valid. Not only that, Samuelson points this out, and I won't bother you with the details. I think the details I wanted to share with you I already have. But he points out now that it was always difficult to do this because it took so long to accumulate the data. And consequently, by the time you accumulated the data, it was no longer valid once it was reported and put together and massaged. So that was a disincentive to even try to do it. Now, however, we have acquired the means to turn it around pretty quickly. This These numbers are for last year, 2018. And we're not even up to the halfway point in 2019 yet. And we got the data for last year already. That means that from here on in, we can continue to report these numbers. We can measure it and see if it's getting better or worse, because it's very, very dangerous. And the more familiar people become with it, the more they're going to recognize the need to do something about it. So there we are. I think that data is astounding. I had no idea that measuring wealth would produce such different results from focusing on income. People talk all the time about inequality based on wealth and income. But when you look at each one separately, they're quite a bit different. And the fact is, when you focus on wealth, the problem even becomes bigger. With that, we've got less than a minute left in our program. We've just about reached the top of the hour. I want to thank you for your continued support, for continually following the program and listening to this and other programs on the Head On Radio Network. And I want to continue for your continued support of the network itself. For Agnes and Bob Kincaid at Head On, and for me, Bill Obrien, thank you so very much. I hope you have a great rest of this beautiful Monday, and everything goes right. We'll be back again tomorrow. Thank you.